Welcome to the third and final part of this alternate history. It is now winter 1943. The United Kingdom, Soviet Union, and Canada are beginning an attack on the mainland United States. Nazi Germany is still fighting with the Soviets in the east, trying to destroy their entire industrial production. All the nations involved have deployed all their forces. There is nothing left in reserve. 1943 is the year that will decide this war. The Soviets, Canadians, and British forces in Canada make a push for Seattle. They are hoping to cut off all American forces north of the city. The Americans are shocked. They did not expect an attack in the winter. They are preparing for a spring offensive and are poorly prepared. On the other hand, though, they are on the defensive, which means that their logistics are much easier. All US forces in Alaska are also ordered to attack towards the south. The Americans are hoping to encircle the attacking forces and destroy them. Time is running out for both sides. The US only has so many weeks in order to link up with their northern forces before they're destroyed from lack of resources. The Soviets also have a very short window of time to defeat the Americans. Every day the Nazis come closer to breaking their back in the east, and they cannot send any more forces to the United States. Meanwhile, all American operations in the Pacific cease. The Japanese are happy to accept this break and use the time to recapture some lost territory and shore up their defenses. A large part of the US Pacific Fleet is transferred to the Atlantic in order to cut off supplies from Britain to Canada and also to escort their ships from the United States to Germany. The United Kingdom still has the largest fleet in the world, even though the United States is quickly catching up. They hope to defeat the American fleet before their numbers are surpassed. British submarines are able to spot the US Navy moving from the Pacific to the Atlantic. They decide to send their Grand Fleet to a massive engagement with the Americans in the Atlantic. They hope to win a giant decisive battle that the Japanese never could. In late February, the British fleet sets sail. They're headed to bombard US coastal cities. They know this is the bait the United States fleet will never be able to ignore. German U-boats are able to provide the Americans with detailed information about the British movements, however. This allows the Americans to be in a perfect position to head off the British in the middle of the Atlantic. The fleets on both sides are absolutely massive. The Americans have 4 full fleet carriers and 4 light carriers, not to mention 5 battleships, 15 cruisers, and around 50 destroyers. The British have far fewer aircraft carriers, only 2 fleet carriers and 3 light carriers, but they have a huge advantage in battleships. They have at least 15 battleships, along with 20 cruisers and 70 destroyers. They hope that they can close with the Americans for a surface action. Unfortunately for the British, however, the age of the battleship is over. Their superiority in battleships means nothing now, and the US airmen aboard their carriers are extremely experienced from all the battles with the Japanese in the Pacific. British air crews on carriers are not very experienced, and their carrier planes are a little bit inferior to the United States. Not only did the approaching battle not turn out to be a British victory, but they narrowly were able to avoid a catastrophic defeat. The battleships that they had were just not enough to overcome the enormous American superiority in terms of carrier aircraft. American carriers were relatively fast, and they were able to stay well out of range of British battleships. While both fleets were somewhat intact after the battle, the British never again would aim to challenge the United States on the high seas. On land, the Soviet, Canadian, and British offensive was starting to grind to a halt. They had not yet been able to cut off all lines of supply from Seattle to the American forces in the north. Soviet reinforcements were also unavailable because all of them were being used in the defense of Moscow. The Germans had pushed incredibly fast, way faster than Stalin ever thought was possible. By mid-spring, the American forces, no longer hampered by the cold weather, were beginning to come into their own. The Soviets had to withdraw troops to fight in Eastern Europe. It was quickly becoming time for the Soviets to decide what was important for them. They didn't really care about Alaska much, and they were far more concerned with Nazi Germany destroying their heartland. Soon thereafter, Stalin ordered all forces to be removed from the Americas and moved to the defense of the East. This meant the end for the Canadian and British offensive. British and Canadian forces fought bravely, but by the end of the year, they were slowly being overrun. They simply did not have the manpower to match the United States. In Europe, the Eastern Front was grinding down into a stalemate. Hitler had managed to take many of the resource-rich areas of the Soviet Union, but not all of them. The Soviets still had a massive manpower advantage. The front was static, stretching all the way from Leningrad all the way down to Stalingrad. The British and Canadians quickly surrendered to the Americans. The peace terms for the British were not too severe. They had to lose all their colonies, but they were not forced to pay any reparations. The Americans were kind to them because they wanted a foothold in mainland Europe. The Canadians, however, were not so lucky. The Americans would not tolerate a hostile power on their continent, and at this time the United States was still very expansionary. Canada was effectively annexed. The entire land was just taken and added to the United States, soon to be divided into new states. Alaska, now abandoned by the Soviets, who were too busy fighting the East, was also finally taken. In the Pacific, the United States began its slow advance across the Pacific again. The Japanese, even though doing much better in this timeline due to the short pause that they were able to have, would still not be able to win the war. The outcome would be the same, even though delayed by a few months. Just as in our timeline, the war with Japan would end with an atomic strike on 2 of its cities. The battle on the Eastern Front, however, between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union just dragged on and on and on. All the way into 1948, battles were still being fought. Logistics were too poor in the country for the Germans to move large amounts of supplies to make further progress. The Soviets had all their industrial capability cut out, and all they had was manpower. This front was completely static and did not show any signs of moving. The Germans asked the Americans to use their nuclear weapons on the Soviet Union to hasten the end of the war. The Americans, however, refused. They did not want to make Nazi Germany any stronger. They could already see the beginning of a new Cold War beginning with Germany. By 1949, neither Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union could really continue the war. Their manpower had been completely spent. Both parties signed an armistice, and the war was pretty much over by 1950. Thank you for watching this series, and I hope you enjoyed it. Please make sure to go back and watch all the previous parts as well, so that this part makes sense. If you're interested, I can continue this series into the Cold War and see how a Nazi versus United States Cold War would have played out. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know in the comments if there are any improvements that I can make to these videos. Thank you.